do we do about it?
Philosophizing about it is...
Or just naming the problem.
Yeah,
right.
We just become like...
annoying.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome to Down to Earth Podcast. We're Jess and Joyce, and we're pastors and speakers and happen to be really good friends.
We love making deep theology accessible for everyone on this podcast, and we'd love it if you join the conversation.
We're also inviting our community of listeners to support the podcast financially this season. So you can become a partner with us on patreon.com/down to earth. As a supporter, you'll have access to bonus episodes, surprise content, and you'll be helping us continue to create content that you really enjoy listening to.
We really value all of our Down to Earth community, and we look forward to interacting with you throughout season 2. Here's to thinking deeply and acting boldly.
Welcome to another episode of Down to Earth. We're glad to have the chance to talk about something quite meaningful today. Obviously, we're continuing season 2's theme of power, and today we're going to explore racism.
Yeah, this is a really important part of power, because I think whenever you have, particularly in the 21st century, but really throughout the history of humanity, this issue of people saying that they're better or that they're somehow superior has been an issue since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And you really can't talk about issues of power in their entirety unless you address the issue of racism.
Yeah. Because underneath it, I mean, any which way you look at racism, it's got power intrinsic. One of the best, I think, biblical references, and maybe I'm just thinking this because I've just been preaching a series in my own church on the book of Jonah, but I think it's a phenomenal example of like intrinsic racism that Jonah was living with, that had been shaped by his idea of being a privileged culture, God's chosen people. And so then when God wants him to go to the Assyrians in Nineveh, his idea of that was like it was anathema. They were like the uber enemies, and he didn't just hate Nineveh because he had some theological quarrel with them. He hated them because he believed they were like a corrupt and sinful and wicked nation that wasn't privileged by God. And of course, when you drill down on Jonah, one of the things we see is he says, I knew that you're slow to anger and abounding in love. So he was worried that God was going to relent. So somehow Jonah knew the heart of God, but he didn't have it. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times we still see this, like even in Canadian culture or Western culture, where people claim to know God, but they don't have his heart. So like even where Jonah had forgotten the long arc of promise going all the way back to Genesis and Abraham, that God was going to make them a blessing to the nations and a light to the Gentiles, it's like it was lost on him. Mm-hmm. And then, we have this bomb-dropping prophetic book. In many ways, it's about Jonah needing to get saved. And then you get to the New Testament, and a lot of people aren't aware of the correlation between the rise, kill, and eat text. I think that's Acts 10 for Peter. And he's like, I've never eaten anything unclean. And he goes through this whole thing. But that rooftop vision is in the port of Joppa, which is the same place that Jonah fled from when he tried to go to Tarshish instead of to Nineveh. And you'd like gone a long time between Jonah and Peter, and the same issues sitting there, that the uber insider like privilege over against people who are on the outside, and not realizing that the salvation that God was after was for everybody, and that everybody's welcome.
Right, and I think often when we read the text, there is a tendency for us to mythologize the characters and to think, or to make it so very introspectively personal that we actually never get to addressing systemic issues of power.
Right.
So we make it about us listening to God about who we should marry, or decisions of work or
Right.
things that are deeply personal to us. But I think if we're guilty of anything in North American Christianity, it is hyper-individualism, which we've talked about before. But I think this impacts how we think about systemic injustice
Right.
and systemic power issues. When the Bible really is full of this calling out of systemic and corporate sin.
Right.
The prophets, in fact, spoke more to corporate sin than they did to personal sin. And I think...
Can we say communal?
I like corporate.
I hate corporate.
It's the worst.
I don't like the connotations.
That's why I'm wearing a suit jacket right now.
Yes, you
and
are.
Joyce is not. And if you could see this, we had this argument at least twice a week. Because
Yeah.
I think the word communal is the worst. It makes me feel like I'm going to be a hippie.
A tree hugger.
Right now.
She's got peace fingers up.
Corporate.
We are talking about power here. So anyways, I just think it's a better word. But I get what you're saying, Jess. And I actually agree with you.
I have to recover from this idiocy.
Of me interrupting over a word. Okay. Back to what you're saying, though. The hyper-individualism.
Can we have an episode on
that word?
definitions?
Okay, great. Let's do it.
Okay.
It could be a bonus episode on Patreon.
Right.
People could listen.
I will be so
I don't think
angry.
anybody
I
would
will be
support
so
us for that.
angry in this episode. Okay, anyways.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, the prophets, the biblical narrative is often about the larger community's sins.
Yes.
And I think, particularly if you go to any evangelical church in the Western Hemisphere, you're going to hear a lot more things about personal sin.
Yeah.
And in some way, I'm not dogging that out. I think we actually have to talk about personal sin. There is a place for that, and there is scriptural precedence for that. But I think when you begin to speak to systemic sin, you get an automatic pushback from people who are like, well, what does that have to do with me?
Right.
How is that feeding my soul?
Yeah.
The reality is, though, no matter where you live, we all encounter racism. And in our context, we're Canadians, so we see racism through the lens of the Canadian context. And I think most people would say, well, Canada is probably has the least amount of racism in it, but the reality is there's still a ton.
Yeah. It's a very real issue.
There was a study done, and it said that the majority of Canadians who are Black or Indigenous have personally experienced discrimination due to race or ethnicity from time to time, if not regularly.
Right.
And this is also reported by South Asians, Chinese people, and other racialized groups. Most Canadians acknowledge that racialized Canadians experience discrimination. And so it's a reality. If you live in the West, you'll know that our Indigenous brothers and sisters often are on the receiving end of this. If you live in the East, you'll know that our brothers and sisters from African descent are often discriminated against.
Sure, and that's for those of you that might be listening in other parts of the world, that's because the majority of different nations, like if you're in Vancouver, you're going to see a lot more Asian population, and if you're in Toronto, you're going to see all the world gathered. And so you can see the racial tensions directly related to the ethnic diversity in those locations.
Yeah, and I was actually really, as we were contemplating talking about power, I was actually really nervous to do this episode, partly because I know it's a place of great pain for many of my friends, and I recognize that I'm not on either. I don't experience that on a daily basis. But I also, as we just talked about it and discussed it, I realized that it was for the very reason that I am not racialized, that we actually have to speak about this. Because while we don't experience it, I can acknowledge it. Yeah. And that's part of speaking truth to power.
Yeah. And I think it grieves us enough that we need to address it. I remember being a kid in a very small village school in southern Ontario, all farming kids, and I remember I looked different than my siblings. There's a lot of jokes about the milkman and the postman, and because I have a different father. But I also was darker, and I heard racial slurs as a child. Now that that continued into high school, even moving out west. But it is not my daily experience.
Right.
I have grown and become maybe more centered. I sit somewhere in the center of the people that I'm around, and so I just don't experience racism and all the spewing of the vitriol and the pain and the marginalization, loss of employment opportunities, a myriad of things. But I think even because we were nervous to speak to it, it also made us realize we kind of have to.
Yeah. And I think while we live in Canada now, I spent some years in the U.S. in my early young adulthood age, and I also don't look particularly, I look like non-disclosed.
Today, today she looks Latino, people.
Yeah, just have a Latino.
Yes, right.
So, but like, I would take girls, so I was working in a church, an inner city church, and I would take girls to the mall, and we'd have cops stop us and say, what are you doing here? I hope you're not going to cause trouble. And I remember being so hot at this cop. And I remember saying to these little girls, they were probably 13 or 14, saying, we are leaving this mall. And I am just trying to bite my tongue not to say terrible things.
Right.
And the kids are like, mistress, can we take our picture with this cop? We are not taking our picture with this man or this cop. We are leaving.
Right.
And I remember the feelings of both shame and
rage
and not really knowing like how to process that, and then recognizing that these girls had that so often.
It was their
that
normal.
They no longer had rage about it. They had, let's take a picture with this guy.
Right.
And when I'd go through the lines of the grocery store, when the first question they'd ask me, I lived in a lower income neighborhood, and they'd ask me, are you paying with food stamps, ma'am?
Gosh.
I remember thinking, like, and how is a young person supposed to get out from underneath this?
Yeah, overcoming.
Yeah. So I have really big feelings towards this, and those big feelings also give me some kind of nervousness about it, because I think, I have experienced this on a number of times, but nothing compared to my friends who have to deal with this every day. So I think off the top of this, what we're saying is we acknowledge that there's so much pain surrounding this topic.
And there's literally no way in a single episode on one podcast that this is going to get addressed. But we just wanted to weigh in and say, when it comes to issues of power, racism has to be talked about.
Yeah, and I think so. The question we have to ask is, why do Christians avoid the topic of racism? So a couple of months ago at my church, I was speaking on. I was speaking about something. It was so powerful. I remember it right now. But I spoke about racism halfway through the thing, and a girl came up to me at the end of the message, and she said, "I just want you to know she was from another country, and she'd experienced much discrimination in her life. She was an ethnic minority, and came up to me and she said, this is the first time in church I've ever heard anybody openly discuss racism. Now, do I think I'm the only person? No, it's just her experience. So the question is, why do we avoid it? Why isn't this a topic we want to discuss?
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about, I think one of the reasons is most of us will say, well, I'm not racist, so it really has nothing to do with me.
Right.
Like sort of the idea, like, I've got 3 black friends, so I mean, of course I'm not racist.
Yeah.
And really, this becomes nonsense in many ways, because not being racist means that you're able to identify, and that you're able to identify systemic injustice. It's not.
Well, and I also think it's got to go further than just the absence of something.
Right.
If we're not going to be racist, we're not going to be party to racism, and it's intrinsic in our society. So that would mean we'd have to leverage our voice, we'd have to respond, and that's risky.
Well, and I think it means also, if you're not racist, you're uncovering things that are racist, which is dangerous.
Yeah, we actually, before we jump a little further into the why, none of us think we have issues with this. in the Jonah series, just a handful of weeks ago, I preached on enemies, and that was the title, Enemies ? And boy, oh boy, a rubber hit the road in our community. And I was talking about anybody you have antagonism toward is the definition of an enemy. And I addressed big group antagonism or distrust, suspicion, and that underneath that is racism. And we looked at, obviously, the Jonah text I've already mentioned, but then we talked about personal issues with people, but also systemic issues with people groups. And so many people, particularly young adults in my church, have come and said, one, I never thought I had any enemies, and now I realize, actually, I do. And Jesus, when he said, love your enemies, wasn't actually talking to some rando one-off person who might read it and think, oh, gee, that's me.
Who's in a gang.
Right.
And now has,
right.
West Side enemies. Yeah.
He was talking to all of humanity. And but the other really big thing, and it came from not minority person, like in your context, but many Caucasian, privileged young adults, and they came later and said, I never have heard anybody address racism in church, and I realize whether I want to acknowledge it, in a group discussion or not, I have racism. There is tendencies
because
in
essentially
me.
it's bias.
Yes.
So if we say it with the word bias, I have a bias towards this or that.
Or a bias against. Maybe there's times where we think, well, we've all seen the films where we realize a person has suspicion or a reaction to.
Yeah. And that is bias. I think all of us have to, we all have to struggle through that.
So what is that? Is it because we think racism is such a big word that we see lynching and KKK and mobs and white supremacists?
I think oftentimes what we're saying is, I'm not a racist. I haven't joined any neo-Nazi group.
Right.
Instead of, I think we have to hold out, or I don't know, it's not hold out hope, it's the opposite. It's that, like, actually have enough suspicion of ourselves to know the depths of our own depravity, to go, yeah, there are probably people that I have bias towards because of their ethnic background or skin color or cultural practices. Because it's normal. I mean, this is how the brain works. If you take anything in biology, you know that, like, stereotypes are important for our brain to be able to organize information.
Yeah.
So if you've ever had an encounter with somebody that was less than pleasant, then your brain naturally, I think, just like we actually have to go, this is a natural process.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, like, but also sin is a natural process. So it doesn't mean that we just go, well, it's natural.
Right.
We actually have to.
Well, there's all kinds of social conditioning. I mean, we could talk for hours about even films. Like, it kind of bugged me when Black Panther came out that this was like a really big deal because there's only 2 white guys in the film.
It's my favorite movie.
Right. Okay. Yes, I know. I think you went to see it multiple times.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
And but you know what? To me, that was it's just a travesty that we think we're being exceptional because, okay, now we've got African American or an African cast. I just think that should be way more normative. And so we've got social conditioning that Caucasian equals center. Mm-hmm. And that gets in the bias hopper.
Right. So I think we do have to say, like, if you have a visceral reaction to why are they talking about this? This doesn't have to do with me. I don't need to deal with this. I think when we have that...
skip this racism episode.
Right. I think when we have that reaction, what we actually have to say to ourselves is, no, I have work to do. Mm. And I think this is ongoing in our lives.
Well, and I don't know if maybe there's some listeners who feel a little bit like you and I, Jess, the nervousness of even recording, realizing we're not going to say it right. We're not going to get the language right. We're going to...
Right. So I think this is another reason we don't like to talk about it, because we're worried. We're worried that we'll say the wrong thing, so saying nothing seems better.
Right. We might make it worse. So
right. But this is like, I kind of think it's akin to, like, when my brother died. A whole load of my friends just didn't say anything. They didn't... Right. And I knew it was because they didn't want to say the wrong thing.
Right.
But truthfully, it's better to say something. Nobody really actually says the wrong thing. Acknowledging pain and acknowledging
Yeah.
marginalization is
Yeah.
always better than just pretending.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that a little bit because we got some practical
I
ideas.
also think sometimes we think if I say nothing, if I say nothing, then it'll be just better. Just like let sleeping dogs lie.
Yeah.
And I think this is particular to a culture that loves to say sorry. So to Canadians that are not very aggressive in their like grappling with conflict.
Oh yeah, we are the apologetic nation.
I'm the exception here.
Right.
But like, so I think we think if I say
yes,
something.
you are the exception. This is why many people think Jess is American, because she is not afraid of confrontation. Let's just be honest.
Sometimes I am.
Yes, but really, at the end of the day, if there's a room full of Canadians,
I just like to get that on. I just like to get that on.
It's going to be you.
I needed to get that on tape.
People
Sometimes
think I'm
I am.
fierce. Okay.
You're afraid though.
The other thing, don't you think? Yeah, I am sometimes. Don't you think part of why it doesn't get brought up, or why we don't want to talk about racism, deal with racism, acknowledge racism, is because we've gone so far in hyper spiritualizing.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, it's just Jesus. That's my whole life's just Jesus.
Well, no, or if we just talk about Jesus,
that'll make it all go away.
It, yeah. So I had somebody that said to me, I don't want you speaking about these kinds of things in our church. Just stay to Jesus. And I think that cannot be our posture. If that was the posture of Jesus, he wouldn't have spoken anything either. He just would have all said, everybody, I'm going to keep repeating a prayer for the next 33 years.
Right.
And say it after me. But he spoke to issues of the day. He spoke to...
well, and how would you preach the New Testament? Like if you didn't talk about the issues.
Yeah, but this is an actual thing right now on the interwebs. Lord. This is an actual thing that people are saying... No social justice, just the gospel. And we talked about this in one of the episodes, in episode 1, but it has become more insane to me. You can't preach Jesus without speaking to these. This is what Jesus was about, bringing the outsider close.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wouldn't even begin to know how to unpack how offensive Peter is when he gets to Cornelius's house. Mm-hmm. If we just got to dive back to Jesus... Some of you got to go and read some of those texts like, no, this is being exposed for a reason. And it's got to confront stuff in us that has real-time life applicability.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard people say this, and I'm always shocked when they'll say things like this to me out loud, but like, well, it's not as bad as you think it is. Yeah, but how would you know? You're a Caucasian person not experiencing this.
It is bad. I mean, we had the privilege of we were writing some of our content last week for this episode, and then our friend, shout out to Gifty. She took us out for Ethiopian lunch, which was so amazing. And for me, because I've been, very sheltered all my life, it was my first time getting to eat Ethiopian food. And the communal nature of it was really beautiful. Like the food was amazing, but also the way we ate together, and then the coffee ceremony and the burning frankincense, and I could go on and on. It was some lunch, but we could say, hey, this is kind of profound. We just been working on this episode this morning, and then we got into some really good dialogue about what it was like for Gifty first to move from Ethiopia to Germany, and then to move from Germany to Canada some years later, and that she's this beautiful Ethiopian woman who speaks fluent German is like mind-blowing to me. And then English, and then finding out her dad did his PhD in like
Slavic languages.
Yeah, like learned the language so he could do his PhD. Like, it just blows my mind. So then to ask questions about what it felt like for her as a minority person in another culture, and just the pain underneath that had become part of her story and the narratives, and the feeling of threat all the time. And she could correlate this to many, many examples in the news even that we would see on a daily basis. I don't ever have experiences of that. I've never once felt like my personhood or my place in the world or my belonging was being threatened. And we know that for many, many people, this isn't some abstract, just refugees in some other part of the world. Many people live with that reality all the time. And then in the same week that we go for lunch with Gifty, we went and saw the movie Just Mercy. Oh my goodness, people go see that movie. It's probably almost done by the time you hear this episode. It won't even maybe be in the theater. And if you didn't go see it in the theater, like, download it. Like, get it and watch it and realize the narratives that are the long tail of systemic injustice tied to racism that haven't gone away. Mm-hmm. Like, we were a bit gobsmacked, I don't want to wreck it, but there were moments in the film where Jess and I were like, I was done college when this was happening. Like,
right. Which we are now admitting that we're the annoying people.
Old.
No, that we're the annoying people in the theater that talk during the movie.
Oh, right. We were gasping a little bit.
Is this shocking to you? No.
We weren't as bad as the old people in front of us. But we did mostly debrief in the car afterward in case you think we are horrible moviegoers. But it impacted us to realize this isn't ancient history. It's like in Canada, we can't talk about racism and not talk about Indigenous realities. Mm-hmm. And you look at the systemic racism that Indigenous people have faced, and then we think, oh yeah, but somehow the residential schools were a long time ago. And then you realize, no, like the last ones were closed in the mid-90s. This isn't that long ago. I know some of our listeners are like, well, that's when I was born. That was way long ago. But in the scheme of big history, no, this is recent narrative.
Right.
And not dealt with. That's why there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And
so I think from here, this is what we began to say. Okay, so how do we actually address this in a way that actually gets on the ground?
Hey, what do we do about it?
Philosophizing about it is...
Or just naming the problem.
Yeah,
right.
We just become like...
Annoying.
Yeah. So we have created a little down-to-earth guide, how not to be a racist.
Yeah.
And there may be more than the things that we're going to talk about. We got 8 things.
Yeah.
You can maybe interact with us and say, hey, you totally forgot this.
Right. It would be brilliant if you message us on social media or email us. What's our email address? DTE.
I can't believe you're asking me.
@gmail.com, I think.
You're asking me. This is the most ironic question of all time.
I don't want to open and look right now.
I don't even know my own phone number is, Reese.
No, you don't. You don't know anything of those details.
No details.
Unnecessary. Filling up your brain and making lack of space for all the other things that matter.
Right. This
okay,
is
but that's a really good suggestion, Jess. If you're listening to the racism episode and you hear our list and you think, what about this? Or you should have added that. Fire it in, send us, or if you got a really great article you want to make sure that we can share with other listeners, whatever. Go ahead.
Okay, so here's the first thing that we think that you need to do, we all need to do, is ask questions.
Yeah.
Learn about other cultures. And I think this is particularly important for those of us that would lean towards the stick our head in the sand and hope it goes away.
Right.
I think this idea of being proactive and leaning in and finding people who don't look like you, who are different than you, and asking them questions, what it has meant to be a minority or what it has meant to be Indigenous living in
and
there.
especially this recommendation, we're trying to get at like learning about the gift and the beauty in their culture. Yeah. So we're going to come to learning about the pain in a minute, but just ask questions to learn about whoever it is you're interacting with that is other than you. And that's a really good starting place. I do want to say, though, don't ask the wrong questions. And I know that that's a little hard because Jess just said it's better to say something than nothing, and I agree. But there are things that'll put you, a person in front of you on the back foot right away. So, like, apparently, it's quite offensive if you're talking to a Canadian who happens to be ethnically diverse, and you say to them, "Where are you from?" And they say, "Drumheller." And they, no, but I mean, where are you really from? Like, no, I was born in southern Alberta. Then you're trying to get at something else. And I've listened to some hilarious confrontations on the radio where people are like, the idea that just because I have black skin or just because I look South Asian doesn't mean I'm not from here. So there are ways to start these conversations that are gonna maybe create tension that you don't want to create. So you could ask someone a question like, what's your ethnicity? Or tell me about your culture. Like, there's ways you can get at it without.
Right. So, but I would say I would like push back on you a little bit, and I think just
of course,
just
it
because
wouldn't be down to earth if we weren't having
just because I think by telling people don't ask the wrong questions, now I'm afraid to ask any question because it might be the wrong question.
Right. But
I'm going to say that true curiosity and true, like, I think if your heart is open, you will not. I mean. And you're not going to offend somebody.
Even if you did,
offensiveness and annoyingness are two different things. They're not the same on the Venn diagram. They're different.
And I will say,
you might be annoying. It's okay. You just might be annoying. We still love you.
And if you step in it, you might learn.
Yeah.
Right. So you won't do that again.
But I think you're making people worried that they're going to. I think it's harder to step in it than it actually is. People ask me every other day where I am from.
Right. And I always get asked, and no one is ever satisfied with the answers.
Right.
Because it doesn't do easy maths.
Okay.
Okay, so ask questions.
Ask questions. But, like, okay, just let me just say to this. Like, I think true curiosity is always beautiful to people.
I think you're right about that.
I think true curiosity never offends people. Now, if you're curious and it's for your own self, like it's selfish curiosity, that's where I'd say be careful about your question. But I think, like, really wanting to be empathetic to somebody and asking them questions about themselves. Listen, I don't care who you are or where you're from. Everybody likes to talk about themselves.
Right. Yeah.
That's just true. So I think if you ask people questions that are genuinely from a place of curiosity and from wanting to learn. Yes.
Yeah,
100%.
Okay.
So I think if it's from an act of love, like if you're a terrible person, your questions are going to be terrible anyways.
Right.
Mind you, if you're a terrible person, you probably don't know you are.
This is where it can get tricky.
You need someone in your life to be a truth teller. It's a whole different conversation.
Okay, so number 1, we're saying ask questions.
Ask lots of questions.
Number 2, this is really important, and if you haven't heard this yet...
where have you been living?
Yeah, you've been under a rock. Stay away from cultural appropriations. And what we mean by that is, like, don't go wearing blackface to a party. Don't wear an indigenous headdress. Don't maybe put dreads in if you're like a full-on...
You did that.
Yeah.
I do love you, but that was...
I had dreads.
But she didn't know. But it was actually not cultural appropriation because you thought you were a different ethnicity.
I was black back then.
But 23andMe has wrecked all of our lives.
Oh, yeah. I am as European as they come. But I didn't look it. So anyways, but that was a long time ago, and most of you are laughing really hard at the idea that I had dreads. But I did, and they look good, and I put all kinds of funky things in them.
Also, you lived
in
on the West Coast.
Yeah,
I'm going to give you a little bit
hippie, I know.
Right.
Everybody knows.
Okay, but so there's a lot of things that this goes along with. Like, I think what we have to be able to be is okay in our own skin, okay with who God's made us, but still able to look at other cultures and say that that's beautiful.
Right, you can celebrate it without
having to become it. Yeah.
Or stealing it. Or like trying to, I don't know. I think it is more offensive than we realize.
Well, because it's turning something that's beautiful in a culture into a costume.
Yeah. Right.
And nobody wants to be like that. That's a real, like, you're playing with somebody's culture. You're saying that it's not real life.
Right. Right.
And that's it's the dumbing it down.
Right.
That's
and
annoying.
I think if you can see it like it's costume instead of the essence of who you are, then you'll understand why it's offensive. Because some people would say, well, I'm just celebrating their culture. I just want to, like, support.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of conversations with people that think that this is that they're not doing anything wrong. But I think for a moment you have to feel like imagine if your culture is not being taken seriously. That's really what it is. It's the lack of seriousness and respect.
Respect, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so stay away from cultural appropriations. That's number 2. Number 3?
Learn the history of racism. Mm-hmm. So I think we have very short memories in terms of history, and I know this now. I didn't understand this until I had children who were like, Mom, you were growing up in the 80s? That was like 100 years ago. Like, they're always asking me things
in
about,
the olden days.
You didn't have a microwave?
What?
And things like this.
Yes.
So, okay, but, like, our minds don't want to say that history is long, but History is very, very long, and something that happened 100 years ago, that's like nothing. That's like 3 minutes in this grand scope of history.
Right.
So something that happened 100 years ago has reverberations today.
Yeah.
So it's not good enough. So I have heard people say this, well, like segregation was like a long time ago, like 70 years ago, so we should just get on with it. Well, 70 years ago was nothing. It's not even a generation.
And the systemic lingering effects and
even if there were no lingering effects,
right,
that history wasn't very long ago.
Right.
So there are still...
Yeah, learn the history.
Yes.
So one thing I want to make people aware of, do you know what a MOOC is? This is like a new thing that I didn't know, but now
it's a massive open online course, Joyce. That's what a MOOC is.
Yes, okay, that's awesome. It's in the notes. That's the only reason you know that. But I had heard people talking about this particular MOOC that's offered through the University of Alberta, which is up in Edmonton. It is a free course online that explores Indigenous histories and contemporary issues in Canada. So I just think that's amazing that the university is offering this course on Indigenous Canada, it's called. So you can look it up, University of Alberta Indigenous Canada course, and you can educate yourself at a university level just about Indigenous issues in the Canadian landscape. And the reason, as far as I understand it, why the U of A is offering it is because it's one of their action steps that they've taken as a university in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the recommendations, the calls to action, which I just want to say, please read the TRC calls to action and then choose which ones you're going to do. If you're Canadian, there's things that you can do as an individual person. There's things that you could get your church community to do. If you're not Canadian, figure out something that would be like an equivalent action of some kind in your neighborhood. But now we've jumped off of learn. And I just want to say, at the very beginning, the very basic, we got to learn, and we can't learn like through our own filter. We're going to have somebody educate us.
Yeah, and I think some of this, it should make you feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I think all learning, all good learning, makes us feel a little bit challenged. So this is true if you're learning trigonometry. This is true if you're learning chemistry, physics. And this is true when we are learning heart things.
Yeah.
So I think those of you that are like, well, I'm never going to do that, that's a pretty good sign that you probably should do it.
It's interesting just coming back to like how we learn. Even if, like, when I hear the recommendation, learn about the history of racism, part of what I think is like a textbook or a university class, like I've mentioned. But I also think we can do things like the CBC Radio has a show called Unreserved, which, as you can imagine, is hosted by Indigenous people, and it's a very good double entendre in the name of the show. But I know a lot of people won't listen to it because they think it's for Indigenous people.
Right.
And I'm like, oh my goodness, I've learned so much about Indigenous cultures, plural, in Canada, and ways that we perpetuate harm and what it would feel like. Anyway, it was really interesting. They had a couple of reporters they were interviewing. I don't know, there's some kind of education thing where they try to teach reporters what to do and what not to do when they go to a predominantly Indigenous community to interview or do a story. And they had these couple of women who run a not-for-profit in the States who do this kind of training on the show. They were interviewing them. And I guess there was some big kerfuffle because somebody had gone up to Nunavut and done a story, and they were from the New York Times. And then they got called out. The New York Times got seriously called out, basically saying your reporters did a terrible job, and it was again stereotyping the narratives, and it turned out the reporter who did the article, whatever the article was, had actually had the training. So why didn't the training work? And so anyways, I listen to some of these things and I think, oh man, I could easily step in it too. What if I went somewhere like that to preach, or even to visit, and you could like have these lingering stereotypes. So one of the ways we educate ourselves about racism is we have to put ourselves in the minority position. Mm-hmm. And so if you can listen to a show or a podcast or watch a TV show that's not your culture,
right,
you're going to begin to understand what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of your culture.
And I think really what it means is placing ourselves in the position and posture of humility. Mm-hmm. I think as soon as we think we have it figured out, then we run into problems.
Right.
And so this kind of takes us, and I realize that 4 is kind of similar to 1.
Yeah.
In that we need to talk to minorities about their current experiences. We can't just, like, listen, if you're in the majority, so if you're in Canada a Caucasian person, you can't just figure this out with you and all your Caucasian people.
Right.
You're going to have to go and find some people who are minorities, and you're going to have to rub shoulders with them and actually learn about them.
Yeah, and even asking things, so this is less about their cultural explorations, but their personal experiences of racism.
Right.
So you can say things like, have you experienced racism?
Yes.
Tell me about that. Or what is the thing that you wish white people knew?
Yeah, so I had one of my professors in university came to stay with my family in my last year of university, and she explained to us, she and her husband were both professors, PhDs, really smart people. They were African American, and she said, when our children turn 16, my husband takes them out, and he gets behind them and pretends he's a cop, pulls them over, makes them do a spread. This is on their 16th birthday. They did this to their sons because she said, we know that this is coming, and we have to teach them how to respond when this happens.
We have no clue.
I remember feeling like I know nothing of the world, and I know nothing of the pain that you go through. So for me to trivialize it and say that happened 70 years ago,
gosh,
not acceptable on my part. Like, that's just shows a lack of compassion. But unless I'd asked her that question, how have you experienced that? How does your family experience that?
Right.
I never would have known that story.
No.
Because that's not something you just like, hey, so I was at the grocery store today. Also,
yeah.
So there has to be poignant and very brave questions.
Yeah.
And some people would take offense to the fact that I'm even calling them brave. Because is it really brave? Well, probably not. But for some of us who are not skilled in asking difficult questions,
right?
From your perspective,
hard, and we would rather avoid.
Right.
So I think this is so important, because I think what will happen is if we begin to ask questions about how other people have experienced racism in their lifetime, now, in the past, and what they wish we knew, even if we don't think, like, I'm not a belligerent racist, like the neo-Nazi stereotype that we have in our heads, even if we're not that, we will begin to realize, I've done that, or I've seen that, or I never spoke up when that happens. Our language will change.
Yeah, and I think we'll uncover our ignorance.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think we don't speak up because we didn't know.
Right.
So until you know, but the only way you are responsible for your own ignorance. You can't just get to heaven and go, well, sorry, God, I didn't know. You've been given a voice, and you've been given.
Well, and that's what we want to get at, is the issues of power tied to racism. Is like, if we recognize we have privilege, which we do, if you sit in the sort of ethnic majority, you have privilege that you're not even aware of. So if we begin to learn and we begin to change, then our actions are going to be leveraging power in a different direction. And that's going to lead to systemic transformation in society.
Right.
Be small. Okay, number 5.
Okay, so this is maybe my favorite suggestion.
Come on now.
Is do not say that you are colorblind. I had countless people say to me, well, I'm not racist, I'm colorblind. Like, that's supposed to be some kind of...
It's a cheeseball euphemism that means nothing.
But it's not true.
Right.
Because none of us are colorblind. I mean, we're not. And it minimizes the gifts and uniquenesses of different cultures. And it also, like...
Right, we're not aiming for homogeneity.
It's like getting out of the car. It's like going to a restaurant and going, I'm food blind. Just feed me whatever. When we all know that is not true of any person ever. Like, you have favorite things that you eat. You have preferences that you... Now, a better way to say it is, I'm open to trying all kinds of food. I just don't think that it's not possible to be colorblind.
Right. And it minimizes the gifts and uniqueness of diverse cultures when we try to make it all neutral.
Yeah.
Colorblind would equal neutral.
Right. I think just in terms of what I think God has called us to build a mosaic, his body is to be a mosaic. And that mosaic has different strengths. And so, like, I'm blind in some areas. My cultures, because I have a couple, are blind in some areas.
Yeah.
And the culture that somebody else brings actually helps me see my blind spots.
Yeah.
And so we need each other. So to say we're all the same,
right,
it's not helpful.
Right.
So don't say that. If that's been in your vocabulary, just decide you're never going to say that again.
Right. And you won't be as offensive. What about number 6? Be willing to acknowledge pain and power abuses. How do we do that?
So I think this is particularly for those of us that are glass half full people.
That would be me.
Right. I think sometimes we don't want to acknowledge that there is pain.
Right.
That people have had to deal with.
Right, like look at how it's deepened your character. You're such an overcomer. You've gone and done great things with your life.
Yeah,
and
like where we bought the one man. Like sometimes I think we've bought into the one man philosophy. Like one man can pull himself up by his bootstraps, and one man can do, and so you can do it. If he can do it, you can do it too. Now I tend to I subscribe to this. I believe people can do things, but I think you gotta acknowledge too that there's hardships that people have to overcome.
Yeah. So acknowledging pain and power abuses, that actually will go a long way to mending wounds.
Like, I think saying to people, like, I see, like, I may not understand, but I acknowledge that you have experienced racism, that you have been treated poorly.
That's awful.
Yes.
Right.
And maybe, and in some ways, that's awful is like a salve to people. Like, that should never happen.
And then what about number 7?
Never tolerate racism in your midst.
Yeah.
So speak up.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we have maybe even if you're not quick on your feet, sometimes somebody says something awful or they make a joke that's not appropriate, or you realize without them even realizing they have wounded someone that's in the group or present.
Or even not present.
Right. But you realize you weren't fast enough on your feet, and later you think, oh man, if I'd thought of this, I would have said that or whatever. Anyway, I think what ends up happening is we think about it later like, too bad. And so I don't want to do that. I want to be a person who has a phrase or a plan in my back pocket that I would actually be able to think, this is what I will say the next time.
Right,
or,
and maybe it doesn't even have to be like a stinging good comeback. As you all know, I'm terrible at phrases, so this would be a nightmare for me to think of something. But I think you only need to stumble through a, hey, maybe we shouldn't be saying that. That's not acceptable. Once or twice, and people will think twice before saying something again. I think the truth is, though, most people, at least in today's society, are not overtly racist.
No.
So the hard part is being able to catch an undercurrent and calling out the undercurrent.
So, and I think it's saying things even gently. You could say to someone, hey, like, it's 2020.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not very appropriate.
Right.
Or I don't know if you realized, but that what you said wasn't helpful, or that was hurtful. Right? And so, and if you don't want to shame someone because you realize that's not they weren't intending, it wasn't like on purpose, quietly take them aside. And I think it's an act of love to confront one another when we are causing harm.
Yeah.
And so to say it's not my place, or I wouldn't know how or whatever, is we got to stop with that excuse making. And if we're going to see systemic racism shift, we're going to have to be people who speak up.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter what our personality is. We're called to be people of justice. So we must.
Yes. And this is where, we've already talked about it a little bit in season 2, but this is where we have to leverage our power on behalf of others.
Yeah, and I think the final thing is that we stand up, and we stand up with and beside people who are experiencing racism. Mm-hmm. And this means that we just stand shoulder to shoulder with people and say, like, not on my watch.
Yeah.
Is this ever going to happen to you? If you're in a position of power, this is particularly important. So as a pastor, this has been a really important thing, because I recognize that I do have some power. God has given me some power, and I have had to confront some things, difficult things.
Yeah.
But it means that I got to stand with my brothers and sisters who at times have felt marginalized.
Yeah. It's really important to have that exercise of solidarity, and it can't just be in theory.
No.
It has to be in practice.
Because evil power must be confronted with godly power.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we must call racism for what it is. It's evil and demonic.
Yeah.
And I think the minute we allow that to take root in the soil of our lives, we're inviting the demonic into our lives.
It's interesting, I think a few years ago, probably 2.5 years ago, it was spring, and I was walking home from school with my kids, and they were like in grades 1 and 3. And somebody had taken chalk, or it was something that easily we could scrub off, but they had put swastikas all over the place in our neighborhood, on the pavement and on people's cars and on the electrical boxes, and it was terrible. And my older son, Finley, he knew right away that was a bad symbol. He didn't know exactly why, but I said, oh, I can't even believe somebody's done this. This is going to hurt people badly in our neighborhood. And so we went home and we got a big broom and a bucket, and we went round and just had to scrub it away. And then we had to go to the school and tell at the junior high school, because we figured it's probably somewhere with the kids that were walking home from school. They think this is funny. It's not funny. And then we had to watch for students for a while, and so we became like the detectives in the neighborhood. And I know this is a very trite example on one level, because did anybody see them? And did those 14, 15-year-old kids know what they were doing? And it's not where we know there are people who know full well what they're doing. But even in a small way, with 6 and 8-year-old boys, they began to learn. We don't just go, oh, well, I didn't put that mark there, or I wouldn't know what to do with that, or the police will come and deal with it, or the teachers will deal with it. Or we knew we had some responsibility as neighbors to participate, to speak up, and to take action, just with a broom and a bucket, and make it other. And I think those things happen more than we realize, that we just turn a blind eye, or we think someone else will address it, and we've got to stand up and with and beside.
Yeah, and this is what it means to be God's people.
Yeah.
This is what it means to belong to Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, I am kind of glad that we did an episode on racism, realizing we don't know enough. And that puts us in the place of the listening community more than some episodes. Some episodes we're talking we know, we're experts, and and we're going to tell. Hopefully we're always saying we're learning, but that's the gift of it being a dialogue. But this episode especially, Jess and I are well aware we have more learning to do, and we just so value that God is a God who will help us. Yeah. He's not wanting us to live in a deficit position when it comes to how we interact with all nations.
Yeah, and I think part of the real, the way we solve racism is through humility.
Yeah.
I think it's the only way it's solved. Yeah. Through humility, saying honoring one another is better than ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think when we approach each other with that kind of humility, it actually brings real transformation.
It's good. Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or go to our website at
www.downtoearthpodcast.com. Feel free to leave us a review wherever you find your podcasts and spread the word.